Lord, who for our sake did fast 40 days and 40 nights, give us grace to use such abstinence and self-control that our flesh may be governed by your Spirit and word, that we may evermore obey your godly motions towards true holiness and righteousness, through the power and might of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Well, we're in volume 3 of Gilbert Burnet's The History of the Reformation of the Church of England. We're in the preface, and he's interacting with some reviewers of his work. We'll just pop in here. I must say a little more with relation to a learned and copious writer of our ecclesiastical history, who finds my history often in his way. He treats me decently as to his expressions, but designs all through to set remarks on my work as if they were well-grounded, must destroy the credit that it has hitherto obtained. I'll give some instances to show what the spirit, the principles, and design of that writer must be. I will name but 4 out of a great many. He's referring to Jeremy Collier. When he set forth King Henry VIII's proceedings against the memory of Thomas Becket, he has these words: though his conduct in this dispute was not altogether defensible, he was far, however, from being guilty of that gross mismanagement with which he is charged. Close quote. I will leave the judgment that must be passed upon this period to all who are in any sort acquainted with the history of that time. When Collier gives the character of King Edward VI immediately before he tells of his death, it is these words: his conscience was not altogether under a serviceable direction. The meaning of this dark expression I do not reach. He was tinctured with Erastian principles and under the wrong prepossessions as to church government. He seems to have had no notion of sacrilege, which is somewhat remarkable. Most of the hardships were put upon ecclesiastics in the latter of his reign, when his judgment was in the best condition. Close quote. And without adding one word of his good qualities, or to correct those severe reflections, he concludes with the account of his death. He gives very different account of the death of Mary, Queen of Scots, in these words, quote, her fortitude and devotion were very remarkable. She supported her character with all imaginable decency. She died like a Christian and like a queen, close quote. And to mention no more, when he comes to Queen Elizabeth's death and character, he runs a parallel between the 2 sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, in these words: the one made martyrs, the other made beggars. The one executed men, the other the estates. Therefore, reserving the honor of the Reformation to Queen Elizabeth, the question will be whether the resuming of first fruits and tenths, putting many vicarages in a deplorable condition, settling a perpetuity of poverty on the church, was not much more prejudicial than fire and faggot. Whether destroying bishoprics was not a much greater hardship than the destroying of bishops, because this severity affects succession and reaches down to future ages. And lastly, whether, as the world goes, it is not more easy to recruit bishops than the revenues to support them, close quote. These words give such an indication of the notion the author has of the happiness or misery of the church that they want no commentary. I will add that this one remark of a fact upon a bishop passage that I had writ concerning the Book of Ordination, published in the 3rd year of King Edward, which was in these words, quote, Another difference between the ordination book set out at that time and that which we now use was that the bishop was to lay his one hand on the priest's head and with his other to give him a Bible with a chalice and bread in it, saying the words that are now said at the delivery of the Bible. The consecration of a bishop, there's nothing more that in what is yet in use, save that his staff was put into his hands with the blessing, "Be to the flock of Christ, a shepherd," closed quote. Upon his remark in these words, quote, "But here as it happens, this learned person has been led into a mistake, for the first two editions of the ordinal made in King Edward's reign have none of the different rites mentioned by this gentleman." I was indeed surprised when I read this and went to look into the first edition of that ordinal, which I knew was in the Lambeth Library, for by Archbishop Sancroft's order, I had the free use of everything that lay there. There I went to examine it, and I found indeed a small variation from my history. The whole is in these words: "The ordination of a priest, after the imposition of hands, with the word still used, follows this rubric. Then the bishop shall deliver to every one of them a Bible in one hand, a chalice or cup, with the bread in the other, and say, 'Take thou authority.'" Close quote. The consecration of a bishop, this rubric is, quote, "The elected bishop, having upon him a surplice and a cope, shall be presented by two bishops, being also in surplices and copes, having their pastoral staves in their hands," close quote. And after the consecration, the rubric follows, quote, "Then shall the archbishop lay the Bible upon his neck, saying, 'Give heed to reading,'" close quote. The next rubric is, "Then shall the archbishop put into his hand the pastoral staff, saying, 'Be to the flock of Christ a shepherd,'" on to the end of the charge, now given all together, but then divided into. This book was printed by Richard Grafton, the king's printer, in March 1549, or by the Roman account, 1550. I have given this full account of that matter in my own justification. I am sorry that I cannot return this learned person his compliment to myself, that he was led into a mistake. The next, indeed the last particular that out of more I will mention, is the setting down the explanation that was made upon the order for kneeling at the sacrament in King Edward's time, wrong in a very material word, for in that the words were, quote, "that there was not in the sacrament any real or essential presence of Christ's natural flesh and blood," but he insists on that puts corporal presence. It seems in this he only looked at the rubric as it now stands at the end of the communion service, upon a conceit that it stands now as it was in King Edward's book, though it was at that time changed. And we know who was the author of that change, and who pretended that a corporal presence signified such a presence as a body naturally has, which the assertors of transubstantiation itself do not and cannot pretend as in this case. Where they say the body is not present corporally, but spiritually, or as a spirit is present. And he who had the chief hand in procuring this alteration had a very extraordinary subtlety, by which he reconciled the opinion of real presence in the sacrament with the last words of the rubric, quote, "that the natural body and blood of Christ were in heaven and not here, it being against the truth of Christ's natural body to be at one time in more places than one." It was thus: a body is in a place if there is no intermediate body but a vacuum between it and the place. And he thought by the virtue of the words of consecration, there was a cylinder of a vacuum made between the elements and Christ's body in heaven, so that no body being between, it was both in heaven and in the elements. Such a solemn piece of folly as this can hardly be read without indignation. But if our author favors this conceit, yet when he sets down that which was done in King Edward's time, with a footnote, quote, "This is a rubric of King Edward's seventh prayer book." The words are, lest yet the same kneeling might be thought or taken otherwise, we do declare that it is not meant thereby that any adoration is done or ought to be done, either unto the sacramental bread or wine there bodily received, or to any real and essential presence there being of Christ's natural flesh. The initials here mean Dr. Peter Gunning, Bishop of Ely. He ought not to have changed the word, especially such an important one. I shall say no more of that work, but that there appeared to me, quite through the second volume, such a constant inclination to favor the popish doctrine and to censure the reformers, that I should have had a better opinion of the author's integrity if he had professed himself not to be of our communion, nor of the communion of any other Protestant church. But as I thought myself bound to give this warning to such as may have heard of that work, or that have seen it, so there is another history lately written in French, and which I hope is soon to appear in our own language, which I cannot recommend more than it deserves. It is M. L'Enfant's History of the Council of Constance, in which that excellent person has, with great care and a sincerity liable to no exception given the world in the history of that council, so true a view of the state of the church and of religion in the age before the Reformation, that I know no book so proper to prepare a man for the reading of the history of the Reformation as the attentive reading of that noble book. He was indeed well furnished with a collection of excellent materials, gathered with great fidelity and industry by the learned Dr. Vanderhort, professor of divinity in the University of Helmstedt, and procured for him by the noble zeal and princely bounty of that most serene and pious prince, Rudolph August, the late Duke of Brunswick, Wolfenbüttel, who set himself with great care and at a vast charge to procure from all places the copies of all papers and manuscripts that could be found to give light to the proceedings of that great assembly. That collections amounted to 6 volumes in folio. From these authentic vouchers, the history of that council is now happily compiled, and if that learned author can find materials to give us as full and as clear a history of the Council of Basel as he has that of Constance, I know of no greater service can be done to the world. For by it Popery will appear in its true and native colors, free from those palliating disguises which the progress of the Reformation and the light which by that has been given to the world has forced upon those of that communion. We have the celebrated history of the Council of Trent, first published here at London, written with a true sublimity of judgment and an unbiased sincerity, which has received a great confirmation even from Cardinal Pallavicini's attempt to destroy its credit, and a much greater of late from the curious discovery of the Vargas letters. But how well and justly soever the history of P. Paolo gave the world that council is esteemed, I am not afraid to compare the late history of the Council of Constance even to that admired work, so far at least as that it will not be allowed to be quite equal with it, yet it may be reckoned among the best of all that have been written after that noble pattern. Since I published my introduction, I fell on many papers concerning the Reformation in Scotland, which had escaped the diligence of that grave and judicious writer, Archbishop Spottiswoode, of which I have given a full account and have used the best endeavors I could to be furnished with all the other materials that I could hear of. It is true I never searched into a lately gathered famous library in this place, but yet I had from some on whose good judgment and great care I might well depend, had carefully looked through it, everything that they found material to my purpose. No curiosity pleased me more than the noble record of the legate's proceedings in the matter of King Henry's divorce, of which I had the free use, as of everything else that was in the library of my learned and dear brother, the late Bishop of Ely, in whose death the church and all his friends, and none more than myself, have had an invaluable loss. I read that record very carefully, twice or thrice over, and gave a full abstract of it, but did not then reflect on what has occurred to me since. For though upon the credit of so noble a record, I have said that the king and queen were never together in court, yet I find the contrary is affirmed by that king himself in a letter bearing date the 23rd of June to his ambassadors at Rome in these words: both we and the queen appeared in person, and he sets forth the assurances the cardinals gave of the proceeding without favor or partiality. Yet she departed out of court, though thrice called to appear, and was denounced contumacious. The only reconciling of this apparent contradiction seems to be this: that they were indeed together in the hall where the court sat, but that it was before the cardinals sat down and had formed the court. For as it is not to be imagined that in the record so material a step could have been omitted, so highly to the honor of the court, so it is not likely that the queen, after her appeal, would have owned the court or appeared before those judges. Therefore, the most probable account of that particular in this, that the king intending to appear in the court, the queen went thither after him, and made that speech to him in the open hall that I mentioned in my former work. But all this was over, and they were both gone before the court was opened, or that the cardinals had taken their places, so that their appearance could be no part of that record. I'm now to give an account of some papers that I add as an appendix, for they relate to the former volumes. The first of these was sent to me by Mr. Thomas Granger, of whom I can give no other account but that I understand he was a clergyman. He dated his letter from Lamerton, near Tavistock in Devon, the 7th of February, 1683-84. I wrote him such a civil answer as so kind a censure deserved, and I promised that I would make my acknowledgments more publicly to him whensoever I reviewed that work. Upon my settling at Salisbury, I inquired after him, but I was told he was dead, so I lost the occasion of returning my thanks to him in a more particular manner, which I now express thus publicly. I had another letter written in another strain, full of expostulation. Anthony, who affected to write himself Anthony a Wood, he thought it incumbent on him to justify himself, since I reflected on him, so he gave vent to it. I wrote sharp remarks on it. One of these, I find, is in the Bishop of Worcester's hand. They were sent to Bishop Fell to be communicated to him, but whether they were or not I cannot tell. The thing has escaped my memory, but the paper still remains with me, and therefore I thought it a justice to Mr. Wood's memory and to his writings to insert it here. The third paper was drawn by me at Paris in the year 1685. History, being then translated into French, was much read, and as to the main conduct of our Reformation, it was approved by some men of great name. At that time there was an embroilment between the court of Rome and that of Versailles, and the propositions that passed in the year 1682 seemed to threaten a greater rupture to follow. Upon that, the scheme of the English Reformation was a subject of common discourse, and that was so much magnified by those who were called the converters, that the hope of a Reformation in France was one of the artifices that prevailed on some who knew not the depths of Satan, and were easily wrought on to make their court by changing their religion in hope that a great reformation of abuses among them was then projected. But one of the learnedest men that I ever knew of that communion said then to myself that all that was only done to fright Pope Innocent XI, who was then in the interests of the House of Austria, but that whensoever they should have a pope in the interests of France, their court would not only declare him infallible in points of doctrine, but even in matters of fact. And he added that it was an abuse that people put on themselves to imagine that with what pomp or zeal soever, the court seemed to support those articles passed in the assembly of the clergy, that this could have any other effect but to bring the court of Rome into their interests. He said that this had been Cardinal Mazarine's practice during his whole ministry. When he could not carry matters to his mind at Rome, he showed such favor to Jansenists as let many of them into great dignities. But when he brought that court to what he designed, he presently changed his conduct toward them. A person of distinction at Paris, finding my history so much liked, wrote a censure upon it. This ran through many hands, but was never printed. It fell into M. Azut's hands, and from him I had it. I wrote an answer to it and got it to be translated into French. It was favorably received by many in Paris. I do not find the copy of that censure among my papers, but I still have the copy of my remarks on it, from which substance of that censure may be gathered. So I thought fit to add this to my appendix. The fourth paper is a large collection of many mistakes, descending even to literal ones, in both volumes of my history and in the records published in them, which a learned person and worthy person has read with more exactness than either my amanuensis or myself had done. I published these sheets as that unknown person sent them to me, whom I never saw as far as I remember, and who will not suffer me to give any other account of him, but that he lives in one of the universities. His copy of my work being of the second edition, only some few of the errors marked that had crept into the second, but that were not in the first edition, are struck out. In several particulars, I do not perfectly agree with these corrections, but I set them down as they were sent to me, without any remarks on them, and I give my hearty thanks in the fullest manner I can to him who was first at pains to make this collection, and then had the goodness to communicate it to me in so obliging a manner, for he gave me a greater power over these papers than I thought fit to assume. The next paper is a much shorter one. It is indeed the abstract of a larger paper, but I have taken out of it only that which relates to my history, and have not meddled with some remarks on Harmer's specimen, and many more made on the rites of an English convocation. These did not belong to my subject, so I've not copied them out. The sixth and last paper was sent to me by the sincere and diligent Mr. Strype, who has descended to such a full and minute correction both of my history and of copies of the records that I confess it gave me great satisfaction. Many of his corrections may seem so inconsiderable that it may be suggested that they were not worth the while, but my whole concern in writing being to deliver the transactions of a former age faithfully down to posterity, nothing could please me more than to have every error I've fallen into discovered. And it was no small satisfaction to me to find that a writer who has now been above 30 years examining all that passed in that age and has made great discoveries of many secrets hitherto unknown, and who is so kind as to pass over nothing, how small and inconsiderable soever it may appear to be, that was liable to correction. That it did not touch upon any one thing that is of any moment in my whole work. This I look on as a very authentic confirmation of it all, except in the places thus censured by one who has searched into all the transactions of that time with so much application and success. This work was composed above a year ago, and after it was read and corrected by some proper judges, it was put to the press and was printed off to the end of King Edward's reign before the 1st of August last, that'd be August 1, 1714. Nor has anything been added to it since that time, except some very few particulars in the last book relating to Scotland. I cannot conclude this preface and so dismiss this work out of my hands without some reflections on what has appeared among us of late, but too evidently in the course of some years. Many who profess great zeal for the legal establishment, yet seem to be set on forming a new scheme both of religion and government, and are taking the same very methods, only a little diversified, that have been pursued in Popery, to bring the world into blind dependence upon the clergy, and to draw the wealth and strength of the nation into their hands. The opinion of the sacraments being an expiatory sacrifice, and of the necessity of secret confession and absolution, and of the Church's authority and an independence on the civil powers, were the foundations of Popery, and the seminal principles out of which that mass of corruptions was formed. They have no color for them in the New Testament, nor in the first stages of Christianity, and are directly contrary to all the principles on which the Reformation was carried on, through every step that was made in the whole progress of that work. And yet these of late have been notions much favored and written for with great zeal, not to say indecency. Besides a vast number of little superstitious practices that in some places have grown to such a height, so that we were insensibly going off from the Reformation and framing a new model of a church totally different from all our former principles, as well as from our present establishment, to all which they added the singular and extravagant conceit of the invalidity of baptism unless ministered by only episcopally ordained, though this not only cuts off all communion with foreign Protestant churches, of which perhaps they make no great account, but makes doubtings to arise with relation to great numbers, both among ourselves and in the Roman communion. This I lament, not that I think there is such sacredness in any human constitution that it is never to be called in question or altered. For if we had the same reasons to alter anything established at the Reformation, that our fathers had to alter the former establishment in times of Popery, I should acknowledge we had as good grounds to change the present as our ancestors had then to change the former constitution. The scriptures are the only sure foundation of our faith that is unalterable. All other constitutions being always to be governed by that perfect declaration of God's holy will with relation to mankind. But it gives a just indignation to see the same men make wide steps to great alterations on the one hand, and yet make heavy complaints where there is no just occasion given, and that about points of mere speculation, whereas the other relate to matters of practice, which had been in former ages so managed that the whole complex of Christian religion was totally depraved by them. And here we call this to an end. Glory be to the Father, the Son, and Holy Ghost. Amen. Godspeed.